All right. So welcome back, everybody. And I am very pleased to introduce Jamie Draper. Let me get my notes because even though I know Jamie, I don't have all of this memorized. Jamie Draper is the museum director for the Air Force Space and Missile Museum at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. And he develops and implements an overall dynamic, sustainable vision for the museum. His 25 years in the museum field reveal a lifelong devotion to history through the preservation and interpretation of material culture. And I will say a couple things. Number one is the reason Jamie is talking about material culture is because he has a bachelor's degree in anthropology from Grand Valley State University. Woo! He has also been, until fairly recently, at the Gerald R. Ford Museum here in Grand Rapids. So he is a local talent, and we are so excited to have him give his presentation this morning. Thank you very much, Jamie. Live on location, Cape Canaveral.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dina. This is great. We had a few technical issues. The mic didn't work, so please speak up if you can't hear me. It's a little windy out here today, but greetings from sunny Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. As you heard, my name's Jamie Draper, and I'm in the middle of this tropical journey, and a lot of you might remember me from Michigan. I want to say hi to all family, friends, and colleagues up there. So I'll let you know I'm still alive and still thriving down here on Florida's sunny Space Coast. But I'm here to take you on a journey, and I hope you enjoy this journey through time and space with us today. As you heard, I'm a museum director, but for the Cape Canaveral Space Force Museum now, formerly known as the Air Force Space and Missile Museum. We recently changed our name to reflect the changing circumstances out here, that we are now a Space Force installation. But the mission, the scope, all of that remains the same. We preserve the hardware and spirit of America's ventures into space. Also, we preserve and present, interpret, restore the extensive military missile testing history that's occurred out here since 1950 along the famed Eastern Range, and I'll get into that a little bit later. The Cape Canaveral is steeped in rich aerospace history. It's been touted as the Kitty Hawk of the space age, if anybody remembers what Kitty Hawk is, a mile marker zero to space, and today it's referred to the world's premier gateway to space. How cool is that? So let me give you just a brief overview of our museum operation. A lot of people don't realize we exist. We actually maintain over 30 facilities on Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. And since 1966, we've introduced millions of visitors to the rich, exciting history of the Cape, of America's space and missile programs, and it's been a wild ride. So we preserve and exhibit a lot of the rarest specimens of aerospace history, from the first re-entry vehicle, first full-size re-entry vehicle into space and back, to America's first reused spacecraft, to a booster that we recently acquired and put in Hangar C, the only booster retrieved from all of America's astronaut programs leading up to the shuttle program. So our collection includes dozens of restored missiles and rockets from a lot of America's Cold War history, and we display those in Hangar C, along with accompanying hardware, capsules, consoles, you name it. Our museum archives contains hundreds of thousands of original documents, photos, published materials, films, engineering drawings, encapsulating the entirety of the space programs out here. And then on top of all of that, we've got the Sand Space History Center right outside the south gate to the installation, our basically our publicly accessible location, where we present the story of dozens of historic launch complexes of the Cape through a series of displays and restorations. We also hold all kinds of cool special events there, educational programming, and military ceremonies, all kinds of fun stuff. And then finally, we have some facilities known as blockhouses on the Cape, several of them from the 1950s and 60s that served as launch control for these various complexes. And those are places where visitors are immersed in that period. They go back in time to the late 1950s, early 60s. So why are we here right now? That's probably your biggest question, with some remnants of a launch facility behind me. We could so easily be going through Hangar C and me showing off the crown jewels, the treasures of the collection, or go through the History Center to see some of the exhibits and take in all of that. But that is too easy. I wanted a challenge, and I wanted to challenge all of you. I am convinced that television, the internet, and social media has not completely sapped your imagination. So I'm gonna kind of work that imagination today. So the title of this presentation is Power of Place: Tragedy and Triumph at Launch Complex 34. And that's what you see remnants of behind me. We're actually going to walk up to the pad now. We're going to test the audio capabilities of this device because it is a little breezy out here. And you can see it's sunny and quite beautiful because it's Florida. But as we ascend this berm to the actual launch pad, we're going to reflect on the immensity of history that took place here. What's great about this site is that it's relaxing. It's a place for contemplation, for reflection. Obviously, a little bit of tall grass here. So the remnants of this mighty launch complex is where we launched the massive Saturn I and Saturn 1B rockets. What makes this site significant is the tragedy that struck here January 27th, 1967.
Sorry to interrupt you, just gonna let you know the sound has gotten a little tricky.
Okay. You know, we could try to use the launch mount as a windbreak, maybe. Yeah. Would you like to try that? Okay, cool.
Sorry about that. I wish the mic would have worked, but we'll walk and talk, and I'll try to speak up. So tragedy struck here in 1967, but triumph followed later in October 1968. These structures that we're walking amongst serve as a reminder, as a testament to the people who risked it all to help us reach the moon. This is one of the most powerful places on the Cape. And as I said, you reflect on the immensity of history that took place here. You feel the extremes of the early space age. All this around me serves as a tangible connection to a very visceral and real past. So while we're up here, let's explore some of the physical elements of this complex. And hopefully the sound is improving a little. So we'll try right here for a little bit. Let's try. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began construction of this site in June 1959. Under the direction of a gentleman you may have heard of, Dr. Werner von Braun, and the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. And it was for a program called Juno 5, the Juno 5 booster program. An agency called NASA, only about a year old at the time, took over the construction and changed Juno 5 to Saturn. Now think about that for a moment. Construction of an Apollo program complex in 2 years before we even launched our first astronaut into space. And that was astronaut Alan Shepard from Complex 5-6, just a few miles down that direction on our museum grounds. That's how quickly things progressed during the space age. All these crewed space programs from Mercury through Gemini to Apollo dwarfed the Manhattan Project in scope, scale, and funding These were massive government expenditures during the heated space race of the Cold War. So looking around us, this pad is 430 feet in diameter. 430 feet. It's built of 8-inch thick reinforced concrete. Just imagine the weight that that would hold. Behind me, behind the pedestal, you could see footings of a 24-story umbilical tower. So here's where you have to use your imagination. A tapered steel tower towering over this pedestal, painted bright red, and servicing the rocket up to moments before launch. And then to the side, there's some railing. Railing here, railing on the other side. And that was for a 31-story tall mobile service tower. So imagine this giant upside down U-shaped structure with the 2 feet settling on these rails. It weighed over 2,800 tons. That comes to about 6 million pounds of steel and equipment to service rockets on this pedestal. Upon completion of its construction, it was the largest movable structure in all of North America. And then the pedestal. The pedestal is the most distinct and recognizable remnant of this complex. You've probably seen it in photos, in videos, and films. This is the remnant of the stand that the mighty Saturns would rest upon right prior to launch. And when you look at the historic photos back in the day, this concrete structure was completely ensconced in steel and piping and equipment. You could barely see it. And it's quite a visual reminder today. It's an amazing piece. It's 24 feet square, 27 feet tall. Now, just for comparison, Alan Shepard's ride into space in 1961 was a Mercury Redstone, and I could almost wrap my arms around half of that launch ring. And then at that same time, they're building this for the Saturns. So this complex includes 2 flame deflectors, and you see them here in the distance. Those suckers weigh 150 tons apiece. And back in the day, they were painted bright yellow, or what we call safety yellow here on the Cape. And they rolled under the pedestal on rails, and they deflected the thrust flame to the side. And you notice there's a slightly different color to the ground on the sides of this pedestal. Well, those are fire bricks. And so the fire brick was much better at absorbing and deflecting the intense heat of those engine nozzles, rather than the concrete. The concrete didn't react too well to it. And also imagine moments before launch with that thrust deflector underneath this massive pedestal, they would flood this whole area with many thousands of gallons of water. And that was to dampen what they called the acoustic energy, or basically sound waves. They learned early on that with these large engines, the noise they generated created these sound waves that would bounce off a hard surface back up to the rocket and knock it off its trajectory. So it had more of a sound dampening feature than protecting of equipment. And that involved massive pumps and pipes and reservoirs. And in the distance, there's concrete structures getting overtaken by nature and the jungle, but they all serve purposes as camera mounts, as LOX storage, liquid oxygen, or RP1 storage, the fuel storage, or other compressed gases. And actually below us is a whole catacomb of mechanical rooms, electrical rooms, and the cabling that came out from the blockhouse. And then the blockhouse where we started, near where we started, is 1,000 feet from the launch pad, not very far. But it's built similar to other blockhouses constructed along ICBM Row. ICBM Row is a stretch where on the northern part of that stretch, it consisted of 5 Atlas ICBM complexes and 4 Titan launch complexes, each one serviced by
I'm sorry, the sound has gotten really, really bad.
Well, let's use this as a.
Is it the winds, Dina? Or is it the
Yeah,
connection?
that's what it sounds like.
The wind. I bet our giant launch pad will help break the wind. Yeah, this is actually.
Is this
Does this sound a bit better, Dina? Yes.
I'm sorry. I wish that mic would have worked, but
Yeah. We can get a little closer to this.
but
Yeah,
we
that's better. Sorry.
Okay.
we'll
Thank you.
adapt and improvise as we do out here on the Cape.
Very good.
So the blockhouse in the distance, the dome-shaped blockhouse. Let me describe the construction process of that because it's phenomenal. And maybe towards the end we'll work our way back that direction out of the wind. But it was actually what they did was they carved out this big crater in the earth, filled it with sand, and they poured this 2-level chamber inside, walls 5 to 7 feet thick of reinforced concrete. Then they poured another big mound of sand over top, which was an additional 5 to 7 feet thick of sand. And then they encased the whole thing with a 4-inch layer of quickcrete. And the weak point would be the entrance. So for the entrance, they have this massive blast door over there. And you'll notice there's no windows, there's no mirror system. They actually used the equivalent of submarine periscopes to view the rocket on pad. And another significant feature of that blockhouse is that we have photos of President John F. Kennedy, Vice President Johnson, James Webb, Kurt Davis, all receiving a briefing within that blockhouse as they toured these Saturn pads in the early 60s. During launch day, there would be 130 people in that building. And that building was known as LCC, or Launch
Control Center.
Launch Control Center. We just call them blockhouses, but that was launch control. And they were responsible for getting that launch vehicle into the sky to a certain distance before mission control took over. And so you understand why it's built the way it was. 130 people in there, only 1,000 feet from the launch. You have to protect those people. So that is the scale of construction of this complex. And it's a scale that the Cape had never seen up to that point. This was the 21st launch complex built on the Cape. And it was built to accommodate these massive Saturn I launches. It was modified between 1963 and 1965 for the even larger Saturn 1B rockets. And the total cost is estimated around $25 million back in the day. That comes to over $250 million in today's money. So now for the rockets. And you know what? Maybe we could, do you want to head over toward the wind break?
Oh, yeah.
Or am I still coming through okay, Dina?
Yeah, you sound okay.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
Well, we'll stay here for a little bit, then we could go back.
That sounds good.
But the rockets. So the rockets are one of the big stories here. And the Saturn ones were amazing rockets for their day. And I think they had a 100% success rate, to be honest. But how can you not get excited about rockets? That it's a giant tube of steel filled with fuel riding a tail of fire into space. And that's just incredible. And I never grow tired of watching the launches out here. So the Saturn I rockets were a Wernher von Braun creation. They were noted as Cluster's Last Stand because the first stage consisted of a Jupiter intermediate range ballistic missile core surrounded by 8 Redstone ballistic missile tanks. They were essentially tanks. I'll specify they weren't the actual missiles, but they used existing machinery to incorporate proven technology into this cluster. So imagine Jupiter, our very first intermediate range ballistic missile. If you followed any of my social media, my hashtag Jupiter Journey series got into all of these connections. But you had your Jupiter core, 8 Redstones surrounding it, and that was your first stage. Absolutely insane. It could carry up to 20,000 pounds or 10 tons into low Earth orbit. And it was basically the first purpose-built booster for peaceful space exploration in America's rocketry program. Even though, I could argue maybe not, because you have that cluster of modified intermediate range and short range ballistic missiles, but history is argument without end. So that cluster could kick out 1.3 million pounds of thrust, which is probably pretty modest compared to some of today's, but these were the biggest the Cape had ever seen. It was powered by 8 Rocketdyne H1 engines, and they could push 1.2 million pounds of steel and fuel and equipment into the heavens. So the first stage would reach about 5,200 miles per hour. That's roughly 7 times the speed of sound, or 24 times the maximum speed of a Tesla. Had to toss that in there. The second stage would deliver into orbit a package at 17,500 miles per hour. So we're talking incredible speeds, incredible power, and this whole package, as far as the rocket goes, stood 18 stories tall on this pedestal. So imagine a massive 18-story tall rocket sitting on this pedestal. Then came the Saturn 1Bs. They were a modified version of the Saturn 1s. Now there were 4 Saturn 1s launched here, but the Saturn 1B configuration was meant for the Apollo astronaut program of getting the Apollo capsules into orbit. They lengthened the first stage and were able to get 1.5 million pounds of thrust out of it, which more than doubled the payload to 40-some thousand pounds that it could deliver into space. So imagine that's a half-fueled Apollo command service module or a fully fueled Apollo lunar module into orbit. So that's the rocket. We talked about the pad, the rockets, all of that stuff. Now let's look at a few of the events. And the first one is Apollo 1. So the Apollo 1 incident occurred in January 1967. All 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger B. Chaffee, were suited up and processed into their capsule about 200-some feet up that direction, but at this spot for what was called a plugs out test. So the capsule was pressurized and powered up. Plugs were pulled. The boosters weren't even fueled. So a lot of the emergency preparedness was relaxed, and a few corners were cut. But I won't go into all the details. You all know the story. There was a spark that ignited the pure oxygen environment inside, and we lost all 3 astronauts. That tragedy shook America to its core. Reaching the moon seemed unattainable at that point. There were congressional investigations. NASA had their internal investigations. A lot of finger pointing between NASA and the contractors. It was absolutely horrible. The worst part is that we lost 3 decorated, distinguished, and accomplished astronauts. Gus Grissom was a household name. He was our second astronaut into space through Project Mercury at Launch Complex 5-6 following Alan Shepard. He commanded the first Gemini mission into orbit. Ed White performed our first spacewalk, or EVA, during Project Gemini. And Roger Chaffee, you all know Roger Chaffee there in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He's a household name there. Eagle Scout, Central High School graduate. I did, just as a little tangent, I would do those reverse job shadows through junior achievement and would go to Central High School and address these classrooms full of students. I couldn't believe I was actually walking in Roger's youthful footsteps through that facility. It was humbling. Also, he was a Purdue graduate. He went into the Navy. He was awarded the Air Medal during the Cuban Missile Crisis, flying dangerous reconnaissance missions. So all 3 were very distinguished. All 3 left grieving families and a grieving nation behind. Flight Director Gene Kranz gave a speech afterwards that was so moving, and he gave it to Mission Control. He told everyone to go back to their offices and write the words tough and competent on their blackboards. Tough for taking accountability for what we do and what we fail to do. and never compromise on responsibilities. Competent, meaning that they will never take anything for granted, nothing short of perfection. Those words would remind them of the price paid by these astronauts. Those words are the price of admission to mission control. I always thought that was a fantastic speech. So fast forward 21 months later, in October 1968, from this spot, Apollo 7 launched from this pedestal. It took astronauts Cunningham. What's his name? Don Isley. Just kidding. As the first successful Apollo launch for the Apollo program, and it occurred right here. Their flight took place in an extensively redesigned capsule. The Apollo 1 incident resulted in 1,300 specific changes to the capsule alone. And during that 18-month period between Apollo 1 and Apollo 7, launch cadence didn't slow down or stop. They continued to test the boosters, the capsules, boilerplates, all the systems. It was rocketry out here is defined by trial and error and learning from mistakes. So their 11-day trip into orbit met the primary objective of verifying the flight worthiness of the Apollo command and service modules, a very important step to our giant leap to the moon. This was a time of celebration for America. Now, Apollo 7 is almost forgotten today. You don't hear much about it, but think about back then. Think about the time of 1968, what all is going on in the world and in this country. And here you had this momentous event. We're finally back on that path to the moon. The tragic sacrifice of the Apollo 1 astronauts led to those specific improvements that successfully got them into orbit. Apollo 7 was the last crewed mission from Cape Canaveral until this spring, because we're bringing it back with Boeing Starliner aboard an Atlas V, taking 2 astronauts to the International Space Station. So astronaut missions will be returning to the Cape, along with many other exciting developments this year. Actually, if the sound is good, maybe we'll just stick right here.
Yeah, that's fine with me. Does the sound okay then?
So let's return to the title of this presentation, Power of Place. And what gives this place power? So my background, as you heard, is history, public history, material culture studies, historic preservation, museum administration. And so what brought me to this mecca of aerospace history? I didn't have an aerospace background, so I'm still a student of all of this, hence my notes here so I don't get too off track, even though I'm doing so right now. This spot is a very powerful place in that it evokes so many emotions, so many thoughts, and it really connects us to all of this history that I laid out. But it's noteworthy mainly because it's a major chapter in the history of America's aerospace and space programs. The Cape Canaveral is steeped in rich history. From Cape Canaveral, you have America's first satellites launched into orbit, first astronauts launched into orbit, first lunar probes, first deep space probes. So many milestones. Since 1950, over 8,000 launches from 30 historic complexes here on Cape Canaveral, and an additional 200 launches from the Kennedy Space Center side through NASA. So a lot of history, voluminous, but there are these flashpoints throughout these complexes. And this is one of them, because this is that segue from the early astronaut programs to the moon. And it connects all of it. All of this is intertwined, from the early missile programs to our space exploration programs. And when you think of spin-off technology, it's so exemplified on Cape Canaveral, because this was a military missile test range. And we modified all of those military ballistic missiles for space exploration. So designed for destruction, repurposed for exploration. It goes with the Redstones, the Jupiters, the Titans, the Saturn, not so much Saturn, but all of those. So that's one thing that gives this power, this place power. Another point, in today's world, we're so fixated and focused on the future, especially in aerospace. All initiatives, all programs are forward thinking. Everyone's looking toward the future. And sometimes we neglect the past. We forget the past, and we do so at our own peril. How do we know where we're going if we don't know where we've been? So a place like Complex 34 provides that essential foundation, that bedrock to guide our decisions today and in the future. A few other points. A defining feature of civilization is a written language. So we use a written language to document our successes, trials and tribulations, and our failures. Combined with material culture and our built environment, such as this site, we create a compendium of collective knowledge to guide our path to a more promising future. One of Cicero's quotes that has guided my professional career goes like this: history is the witness that testifies to the passing of time. And so in that analogy, history as the witness, all of this as the evidence. And that's another aspect that gives this place power. So what else? Well, I mentioned it's a tangible connection to a very visceral past. This is where history was made, the darker moments and the triumphant ones. You can see it all around us. You could touch it. You could feel it. You could sense it. You could draw it in. This is an amazing spot. You can't replicate this experience anywhere else. You can only experience it here. Launch Complex 34 is where we memorialize 3 astronauts who paid the ultimate sacrifice for our space exploration programs. So there's a solemnity to this site. Here is a site of America's first deep trough of despair and grief during our history of space exploration. Others would follow later with Challenger and Columbia. And yet, this complex serves as a source of celebration and pride in the successful launch of Apollo 7. America didn't give up. We didn't just throw in the towel. We persisted, we progressed, we upped our game. So, why do we fall down? So we learn how to pick ourselves back up. And that's what we did here. The success of Apollo 7 led to the giant leap of Apollo 11, which was on the near horizon. Here we walk in the footsteps of our history makers. And that's not just the memorialized and celebrated astronauts, but the thousands of others who made their journeys possible. And I'm talking about the engineers, mathematicians, chemists, but also the guys here at the site, the pad rats, the fuel system guys, the electricians, firefighters, launch control, mission control, they all played a role. And we seek to preserve and present their stories as part of this overall narrative as well. As I mentioned, this complex fits into a larger narrative of Cape Canaveral and America's ventures into space. It's a very important chapter. But another thing that gives this power is that this is not a dead historic site. Cape Canaveral in general makes history weekly. We have launches here weekly. In fact, just over in the distance here is Complex 37. That's the sister pad to Complex 34. Saturn ones were launched over there as well. This was decommissioned in 1971 and deactivated. That was repurposed later on for Delta programs. And right now there's 3 tubes in that structure, and that's the next Delta Heavy to launch from the Cape. This year we've got Falcon Heavies, Delta Heavies, Relativity Space with their 3D printed rockets, launching their Terran 1 rocket. All of these little startups. It's an exciting time to be alive on the Cape, and it's an exciting time to connect all of this history with current ops, because it's all relevant, it's all intertwined. And since hopefully I'm not too long-winded, are we doing okay?
8 minutes left. And
okay.
yeah.
Well,
I think there are potentially questions. I'm not sure.
So I'm gonna wrap up and get a little philosophical here for a moment. So finally, how does all of this fit into our past, present, and future explorations into space? Well, Complex 34 gives us clear answers to the where, when, and how that helps guide us to the what and why. And I know that doesn't make a lick of sense, so let me explain. The where is easy. The where is historic Launch Complex 34 on Cape Canaveral Space Force Station here on Florida's sunny space coast. The world's premier gateway to space. The when would be the 1960s. That's our main focus here, and that really eventful period during America's space race with our opponents during the Cold War, and really the height of some of the massive government expenditures toward our space programs, along with our missile programs. So that's the when. And there's a lot going on in the 1960s all over the place. The how, well, I described the how, the construction of this site, its function, its physical makeup, the rocket systems that launched here, the events that unfolded, the tragedy and triumph, that's all the how. So how does that lead us to the what and why? Well, the what is, well, now we have to use that collective knowledge and engage in some deeper thoughts, discussions, intertwine some additional history, science, philosophy, and maybe even a little faith, and address the larger questions of what and why. What is our purpose and why are we here? But those discussions are above my pay grade. So I'm going to kind of wrap up with that. I hope you enjoyed this very brief journey through time and space, and I'm happy to stand by for whatever questions you have. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Jamie. We really appreciated this. We've got a few questions in the chat. There's room for a few more, so don't hesitate. First one we got, curious about the abandon in place that is stenciled on the launch pad.
Yes, that's a very good question. It's actually on the other side.
Let's venture into the wind. Let's try it. Yeah, see if it gets bad.
And as we progress, you'll see that there are some memorial plaques scattered around the site. So the wind isn't too terrible. Here you could see the remnants of the abandoned in place stenciling that was put on there by the U.S. Air Force. And that is a real property designation when a facility is no longer in use. They strike it from the facility logs, and they stencil abandoned in place on the structure. And I like to say, yes, it's abandoned in place, but not forgotten. And we're here to ensure that we slow the deterioration of this site to help preserve it for later generations, so we can tell these stories over and over again and add to them. So yes, abandoned in place, but not forgotten. And on the subject of the memorial plaques, we've got several memorial plaques and some memorial benches for the Apollo 1 astronauts. You can see the benches in the distance. Once again, I apologize for the wind, but we're right on the ocean. I want to point out that last spring, a memorial was added to Arlington Cemetery for the Apollo 1 astronauts. That was a very good move, and I was happy to see that, because we've got the markers here, but there's very limited access here. Much better access at Arlington. Maybe it was too
Yeah, we'll
much.
go high. The wind is fluctuating quite a lot, and I'm sure it's affecting the audio. This is a good windbreak here.
Yeah, we're definitely getting some sound of the breeze.
Okay.
There we go. Well, living on the ocean. That's what you do.
I've got another question, but first I just want to send a quick shout out to Mr. Larson's class. So sorry about the technical goof that you guys are experiencing. That's my fault. Continuing to work on that, but hopefully your workaround is continuing to work. Just wanted to acknowledge that. Another question, in spite of the concrete and steel that the launch complex is made of, how well has it held up? And I'm looking around you. Any signs of decay to the point of making it unstable to approach? Any remediation that's been done already or is planned in the future? And that's a great visual for this.
Yeah, oh, great question too. So when they decommissioned this site in the early 70s, not too long after, they began removing all of the steel gantries and towers. And that's because we are in one of the most inhospitable preservation environments in the world, which poses huge challenges for our museum operation because that's our major task, is preserving all this history. So as you could see, a lot of the elements I described, the umbilical tower, the mobile service tower, those have been gone for decades because that steel would just corrode and pose a major safety hazard. Now, the deflectors are still here. I guess it's thick enough steel and not towering high enough to become a safety issue. The concrete is actually probably the most stable thing here. You can still see some steel sheeting on the pedestal, and the ring above us, they've removed a lot of the corroding steel just in recent years to prevent it from dropping on people. And them doing that has allowed us and visitors to wander around these ruins without too many safety hazards. We still have some corroding steel elements, some I-beam remnants, but it's relatively safe to visit and take in. The fire brick is preserving fairly well. This has the potential, with periodic treatment, of sticking around for many, many generations to come as is. There's no plans on reconstructing any elements out here because, being right on the edge of the ocean, nothing will last very long out here. So, you know, there's, like I said, there's power to the ruins, to the remnants. You know, it allows you to embrace your imagination to kind of feel what occurred here back in the day. So hopefully that long meandering answers some of those questions.
Yeah, I think that was a great answer. And it made me curious too, if somebody wants to visit there, is that possible?
So I anticipated that question most definitely, because everybody really wants to see this and other sites on the Cape. So in past decades, Kennedy Space Center Visitor Center has run a daily bus out to a number of these sites. That bus tour has been on hiatus for a while. Right now, there's an outfit called Canaveral Tours that runs tour excursions out to a number of these sites, but they don't come out to this one specifically. What I'm working on with our museum operation and Space Launch Delta 45 is for us to develop something internally to bring visitors out to these sites, for them to experience this, because this isn't something we can move outside the gates. We have plans in the future, in the near future, of expanding our museum operation outside the security perimeter to bring more of this history out to the public, because nobody gets into the museum game to deny public access to history like this. So when we do that expansion, maybe before we do that expansion, hopefully we can develop our own touring system out to these sites to share it with as many people as we can.
Right. Thank you for that. Another question, and I feel like I want to add my own question to this question, so I'll read it and then I'll add my own addendum. How was the transition from working at a presidential museum to your present position? And they said it seems to be a leap in subject material, and wanted to know if you've always been a pad rat at heart. And then my question, which you can add on or subtract or whatever you want with it, is I'm curious whether your anthropology degree, I know you also have a history bachelor's degree, but I'm interested in the anthropology degree, how that figures it all into what you do where you are now.
Well, good questions. Yeah, it was a giant leap going from 16 years of presidential history into a virtually brand new subject for me, which was aerospace history. Now, my research in the past kind of skimmed the surface of aerospace history when I was doing some Cold War research, and I worked at a presidential museum for a Cold Warrior president. So there was a little bit of overlap from the top down presidential look at Cold War policies. But here, this is the hardware, the test complexes, and everything that was the physical connection to all of that. So it's been a very interesting adjustment. When I took the job, I explained I love fascinating history. I'm drawn to fascinating history, and this has got to be at the top of fascinating history out here. But I don't know much about it. And they said, "Oh, don't worry about it. We just need a museum professional to do something with this place. And you've got 100 subject matter experts in your volunteer corps. They know everything for you." And that includes Kurt working the camera here. He's one of our experts. So it's been a lot of fun. And when I look back and think about how completely uninformed I was on all of this before moving down here, it's almost embarrassing. I'm still very green, but I'm a lifelong student of history, and I'm absorbing as much of this as I can, because it's amazing how relevant it is to our everyday lives. I mean, the technology we're using right now has been launched from this site and has been developed from all of these space systems out here. So no, I've not always been a pad rat. That's a new designation for me. I've been very welcomed by all of these groups down here, from the space hipsters, Cape apes, pad rats, rickety rocketeers, rocket ranchers, range pioneers, you name it. There's so many amazing people, completely connected and engaged with this history. I couldn't ask for a better experience. So
you know what, that sounded like an anthropology project right there with all these different tribes.
Yes, definitely. And as far as anthropology goes, so funny enough, at Grand Valley State University, I was a history and anthro double major, and my emphasis was ancient civilizations and cultures. And then went to grad school for historical administration, went into local history, presidential history, and now aerospace history. I'm a little ADD, I guess, when it comes to all of this, but I'm always seeking out greater challenges, opportunities, and a whole lot of fun. And this ticks all those boxes. So for anthropology, I'd have to dig deep to recall a lot of that. But anthropology is a lot of study of culture, of people, of analyzing, it kind of meshes with history, with the cause, course, and consequence of all of these events, places, groups of people, and it's all intertwined. I'm sure if I gave it some real thought, I could come up with some good answers to the anthro question. But I know that the experience and the education I garnered from GVSU has been, immeasurable in helping me with all of these projects over the years.
Awesome. Well, that's terrific. Thank you so much. We're just about at time. I also want to thank Kurt. We can't see you. Maybe we can see Kurt for a quick second.
Happy to help.
Hey, Kurt. Good to see you. Thank you so much to you both. And once again, take care, and we'll get back in touch. For everyone else, we're going to be taking a short pause until 11:30, when we will come back on with Dr. Asif Siddiqui. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Jamie and Kurt. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.